Friday morning, she was there. I was finishing breakfast and looked up to see my cousin standing on our back steps. My heart jumped as Mom let her in. "Hey, Maddie!" I was so happy and relieved that I wanted to rush over and hug her, but somehow I knew you just didn't do that with this girl. I looked at her eyes and thought the fortress seemed a bit less guarded for the moment. One corner of her mouth kind of turned up when she saw me, like she was secretly glad too. Mom looked her up and down, and I knew she'd have plenty to say later about her clothes, shoes, hair, and stale cigarette odor. Maddie only pretended she wasn't aware of the scrutiny. "Aren't you going to be awfully cold this time of year in knee socks?" Mom asked, glaring down at Maddie's bare knees. Apparently she wasn't going to wait until later to make comments. "No, I'm fine. Thanks." Maddie wasn't fazed. "I see. Well, isn't Annie going to school?" My mother questioned as if she worked for social services. "She's in afternoon kindergarten," Maddie explained patiently. "I have to come home for lunch and walk her to school for Ma." "That's a good girl," my mother said approvingly. "Come on, we'll be late." I was glad to interrupt the interrogation. Maddie held the door for me, and I gave my mother the expected peck on the cheek before bolting outside. I noticed that she still carried the shabby navy blue school bag with the tattered old St. Clement's logo. It was a simple sack with a drawstring top, and she slung it over her shoulder like a boy as we left. We walked fast in the chilly morning air. At least it was dry, with no snow on the ground. "Hey, Maddie," I began. "Hey," she answered absently. Where were you all week?" "I was beginning to think you weren't moving after all," I explained. "I said it'd be next week. It's next week." I was a bit stung by the curt answer. I changed the subject. "Where's Tommy?" I'd almost forgotten about him. "He's around." Edmonds Elementary was only a block away, but you had to go around the corner of my street and walk on the sidewalk opposite the projects. That's the place where I sometimes ran into trouble. I stayed on the neighborhood side, and the project kids stayed on their side, except when they deliberately crossed over to start something. As we rounded the corner of Mulligan Street, I wondered where Maddie would feel she belonged. River Rat kids usually stayed in the old projects, and they fought with new project kids. Now she wasn't even a project kid anymore, but she wasn't one of the neighborhood kids either. I guess living in Old Lady Malone's house was different altogether. She seemed anxious about something and suddenly pushed her school bag into my hands, whipped a cigarette out of her pocket, and lit it fast without breaking her stride. That's when I heard the quickening footsteps behind us. A couple of boys were following, keeping pace. They seemed to come out of nowhere, as if they'd been waiting all along. They must have been behind the tall hedges that bordered the last yard we passed. Maddie didn't look back or change her pace, and I knew she'd already seen them. I kept quiet. They were walking faster, closing the gap. I wanted to run, not that it ever did me any good. They were right behind us now, and she just kept walking at the same pace, puffing away. I glanced back and recognized them. Billy Smith and Kevin Day, one of Dottie's cousins. They were pure meanness. "Hey, girlie," came a taunting voice that was ironically still high-pitched like a girl. Said in that provocative tone, it was a simple but effective insult, as if it were somehow distasteful, even shameful, just to be a girl. The words were drawn out in a sickening sing-song that struck a raw nerve. It was the denigration that frightened me. I'd witnessed that to devalue another is the first requirement of violence. Whatever this boy had in mind wasn't good, and he was clearly savoring the process. Maddie came to a full stop and took a resolute drag on her cigarette before handing it to me. She turned around and faced them, then exhaled slowly like she was mildly annoyed and only a bit bothered.